I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the live is starting. Um, uh, all right. Um, so we are indeed live. Um, and um, unfortunately, okay. So we are indeed live. I am going to I'm going to send Debra a link to our live chat on text because I can't do it in the thing. And it's really great to see you all. I'm using a new technology, well, a new old technology to me. So I see you guys there, and hopefully this will work out well. And just, I know you guys, so I know you'll give us a moment of grace to make sure everything's working properly. And so right now I am going to introduce Debra Shushan and introduce today, and then we'll get started. So here we go. Hi, all. I'm Stephanie Wilson, and I want to welcome you all to Freedom Over Fascism Live. Today, I will be talking to Dr. Debra Shushan, a Middle East and U.S. foreign policy expert and senior resident affiliate at Georgetown's Center for Jewish Civilization. She's taught at top colleges and directed Israel-Palestine policy and advocacy at J Street and Americans for Peace Now. I first saw Debra on Waj's show, The Left Hook, and she's interviewing tons of really interesting people. You should definitely hit the bottom at the top of the screen and subscribe to her Substack. All right, so before we get to our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about where we are right now. As you all know, the Congress passed nearly unanimously a bill to release the Epstein files. I was going to talk to Ellie Leonard yesterday, but my hot water heater decided to burst and flood my basement, so I had to take care of that. I'm mentioning Epstein now, not just because of all the revelations of the sex and human trafficking ring, but also because of his financial dealings, corruption, and dealings with multiple foreign governments, including Israel, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. We know from previously released information, very well researched by Zev Shalev, who I talked with last week, and you should definitely be subscribing to him if you're not. That's at narrative.org, NARATIV.org. He has traced the entire financial web of corruption that Epstein sat in the middle of. And one other thing we know from Epstein's emails is that he had pictures and compromising information about Trump that he shared with Israel and Russia for sure, and possibly other governments like Saudi Arabia's. So as a background to what we're going to discuss today about MBS's visit to Trump and the fancy dinner and all of the bells and whistles, we have the knowledge that a bunch of leaders had compromising information about Trump and also knew that he could be easily bought. So Debra and I are going to start talking about MBS's visit to DC this week, Trump's welcome, Saudi Arabia's investments in the U.S., the web of global corruption, particularly in the Middle East, beyond Israel-Palestine, and then we'll see where we land. Before we start, thank you so much for being here. Please subscribe at the top of your screen to my Substack and keep hitting those heart buttons because that'll really help in the chat. And if you can afford, please choose a paid subscription. I don't paywall anything, but I do need to support myself. So next up, next Tuesday, I'm talking to Chris Armitage, who talks about soft secession and other ways to oppose the regime and actions we can all take. Thank you for the hearts, people. I'll also host a Zoom for paid subscribers on Sunday, and I will try to put the registration link in the chat and certainly out later on my Substack. So let's start our conversation with Debra Shushan. I'm not sure, Debra, that a lot of folks know you very well. Can you give us a quick update on who you are and what your specialty is? And then we'll start talking about the other thing that happened yesterday, MBS's visit.
Sure.
Let's get started.
Amazing. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for having me. It's really pleasure and honor to be on your great program. Yeah, let me just real quickly say a few words about me. I've had kind of a weird, crazy career and still figuring out how that all plays out. You know how that is.
Yeah.
You know how that is. But yeah, I'm an academic by training with a PhD in Middle East political science stuff, taught for a decade Middle East politics at the College of William and Mary, which is teaching is wonderful and awesome. And I'm excited to be back doing that at Georgetown in the spring. I'm going to be teaching a class which is not at all controversial and should be totally boring, called Jewish Americans, U.S. Politics in Israel, Palestine. So to give you kind of a, boring, totally boring class. And then after having been in academia for a bunch of my career, I decided to get into policy work. I moved up here to DC. I worked for a couple of organizations. I think you mentioned J Street, Americans for Peace Now. Basically heading lobby work and policy work for progressive Jewish organizations doing Israel-Palestine stuff. So, that's kind of a little bit about me in a nutshell. And now I'm doing this Substack, the debrief with Debra Shushan thing, and talking to people that I find fascinating, and that's kind of fun, like you.
That's what I do. And frankly, your career is the road I didn't take, because that would have been sort of where I was headed to, because my PhD is in Middle Eastern Studies, but on the historical side. So, so lots to talk about here.
Yes,
so as I said,
absolutely.
We know, this is all intertwined, the Saudi Arabia, MBS, Epstein, corruption, murder, all sorts of good stuff. And rape and trafficking and all of that stuff. But we don't need to talk about that today, although we could talk about murder. So MBS came to visit DC yesterday, and I know you were in the city. So tell us about that visit and what they discussed and why it's important.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned it that way, Stephanie. I didn't tell you this. You knew that I was going into DC for some meetings yesterday. So I live here in Northern Virginia, as you know. I get off the metro, arrive in DC, and a minute later, I hear military jets flying overhead. I look up, and it is quite a sight to see, Stephanie, let me tell you. 5 stealth bombers flying in formation.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I see 5 stealth bombers flying, in a perfect V. It is quite a thing to see. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
Well, I've seen back in San Francisco, they used to have Blue Angels fly every year.
Yep.
But that was for show, and now.
Right. So here's the crazy thing. So I see this, and of course everybody around, we all look up like, oh. And here's what comes to my mind. The last time I saw / heard fighter jets was what I have no sense of time. It happens when you hit our age, right, Stephanie?
Yeah, but I think COVID fucked us all
COVID,
over.
who knows what it is. Anyway, what was it? 2 months ago, something like that. I'm here in Northern Virginia, standing outside my house, and I hear fighter jets flying overhead. And I was like, what the hell is that? And it was only later that day that I found out it was the day of the Epstein victims press conference, like 2 months ago. Remember this? When
Mhm.
he actually had like a fighter jet flyover in the middle of their damn press conference to interrupt their press conference. So that was the last time here in the DC area that I saw / heard a military flyover. So I'm in DC. I look up, I see this formation of stealth fighters, and I'm like, holy shit, the FC victims press conference must be happening right now. And he has to up
Well,
the
it was
ante.
also.
Right. And he has to like up the ante this time and do five stealth bombers flying in formation. And I'm just like, oh my God. So I look around me and I see this like random dude. And he, of course, has just seen the stealth fighter formation like I have. And he just like shakes his head, right? And I just look over at him and I was like, I guess it's the Epstein victims press conference. And he says to me, he was like, no, they're welcoming MBS. And I'm like, yep. I mean, of course, I knew the MBS visit was happening, but it was just like, it all comes together, right? It all comes together. This sort of split screen of, on the one side, this nearly unanimous vote in the House, which had been shut down for 6 weeks to prevent this very vote from happening. This fascinating crumbling of, Trump's, at least on this one thing, right? Trump's iron fisted control over the Republican Party. The Senate, by unanimous consent, passes the same, I mean, it's incredible. So all that is happening. And at the same time, this military, stealth fighter flyover thing is happening to help, like, and the MBS visit is happening to distract from all of that. And like, so that Trump gets to portray himself as this big, powerful, amazing leader who is bringing peace to the Middle East and the world. And of course, bringing in billions, if not, supposedly $1 trillion of investment to the United States. So
Right.
pretty extraordinary. So it was very interesting to be in DC yesterday when this is happening.
Do you
But
mind,
yeah,
Deborah? I'm
yeah, go
sure
ahead.
everybody is in this chat knows who we're talking about with MBS, but can you just
Absolutely.
quickly?
My apologies. Right. So MBS is Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. And he's, young, in his 40s. As Trump pointed out repeatedly during their press conference yesterday, which, we should definitely talk more about. He will be king of Saudi Arabia. I mean, his father's very sick very old, very sick. So Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, is, for all intents and purposes, the leader of Saudi Arabia. His father will die. He's in his 40s. And as Trump pointed out, very admiringly, I may add, in this press conference, this man will be king for decades. And yes, so, and, there's a lot more to say about Mohammed bin Salman, of course, who gained a lot of international attention, shall we say, and notoriety in 2018, which we should talk about. But
Yes.
that's essentially who we
Okay.
are talking about when we say MBS. Yeah.
Okay. So, um, so let's talk a little bit about kind of where we are now, 2018, and so Trump announces that Saudi Arabia is investing $1 trillion the United States when their GDP is only 1.1 trillion. So clearly that's a little suspect. But why don't we go back let's go back to when Trump first was elected in 2016, and his first, I believe his first state visit was to Saudi Arabia.
That
And
you're
let's
Yeah,
start
no,
there.
you're absolutely right. That was his first trip, first visit in 2017 after becoming president, was to Saudi Arabia, and it was a really big deal at the time. As I'm sure, as you may remember, as others may remember, it was a really big deal at the time because typically a president's first visit would be to America's key allies, fellow democracies. And the fact that then first term President Trump's first visit was a very cozy, friendly visit to Saudi Arabia. A regime that which is first of all obviously authoritarian, and had a history, even before what we're going to talk about in 2018, of course, of flagrant human rights abuses. The fact that that was Trump's first trip was very significant. And we obviously, it's interesting to think about it, since 2017. And I mean, of course, US Saudi relations have been evolving, for decades and decades, but just over this past decade, through the first Trump presidency, through Biden's presidency, and now in many ways kind of the logical culmination of everything with just an extremely friendly, I mean, Trump mentioned, I mean, I hesitate to tell your dear viewers and mine to, put
Bring it on.
themselves through the torture of watching the Oval Office press conference between Trump and MBS in its entirety, if they haven't already seen it. But, it's extraordinary. And I mean, you have to think about, I think about it as well in line with all of the press conferences with foreign leaders that we've seen in this second term. Obviously, we all saw the press conference with Zelensky back in February, which was just jaw-droppingly
Horrifying.
unbelievable, horrifying and unbelievable. So you have that on the one hand, you have various European leaders on the other hand with these super awkward situations with Trump. And then you see him with MBS, and just emphasizing how good, how close friends they are. He even talked about, how like they'll just call each other up at night to chat. And it's just like, you know, it's incredible. So there's been quite an arc from 2017 until now. And of course, part of that arc is what happens in 2018, which, if you like, we can.
Well, let's start there because Trump's um, reaction to questions about it yesterday were very, very Trumpian, frankly. But, and we think that every time that we know how gross he is, but these things can sometimes be unsurprising yet shocking. So, yeah, let's talk about Khashoggi and what went on there and how it fits in with the rest of what we're talking about, and remembering that our general frame is about corruption, and we'll eventually get to the Saudi wealth fund. They basically just invested a shit ton of money with, and then they funded Jared and blah 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 blah. But let's start with Khashoggi.
Yeah, right. So, I think we obviously will talk about the corruption piece, which is incredibly important. But let's also talk about, and this is what the human rights and authoritarianism piece. which is, and of course, these things all fit together. They're not separate. But, just to remind folks, because I think, obviously everyone knows who Jamal Khashoggi was. He was a Saudi dissident who moved here to the United States, to Northern Virginia, somewhere here in my neck of the woods. And he was a writer, columnist for the Washington Post. Um, and I think and as everybody knows, right, he was murdered in the Saudi embassy or consulate in Turkey. I think it's really important for us all to kind of take a step back and remember how, I mean, any murder is terrible, obviously, but just how depraved what happened to Jamal Khashoggi was. I mean, this is a man who was lured to go to the Saudi diplomatic facility in order to get, he had to get certain paperwork that he needed to marry his fiance. He's lured there. A Saudi, I don't know, murder team was there waiting for him, and he was not only murdered, he was beheaded and dismembered. And folks may recall, but it's worth mentioning, that all of that was caught on audio tape. I mean, you can listen to the audio tape of Jamal Khashoggi being systematically dismembered, while still alive. It is one of the most depraved, horrific things that you will ever listen to in a world in which, unfortunately, there are a lot of horrible, depraved things. And there was just, after this happened, obviously there was just huge outrage over what happened, even in, when it happened at the time in 2018. Donald Trump condemned it as, terrible and horrifying, and said whoever's responsible, had to be held accountable. And then, very inconveniently for Donald Trump, there was an intelligence report, a U.S. intelligence report that came out and was then leaked, which said that, it was highly likely, with a high degree of confidence, that MBS knew about or even, ordered this killing. And for anyone who knows, as you and I do, knows anything about the, Middle East regimes like Saudi Arabia, I mean, of course that's the case, right?
Something no like one freelances anything.
No one freelances. Exactly. You put that perfectly. I mean, this could not have happened. The luring, the, death squad that was there ready to dismember him, like, that doesn't happen unless, the de facto head of state orders it, directly. So, of course, that was not surprising that U.S. intelligence and lots of foreign intelligence agencies came to exactly the same conclusion. So then, Trump is put in a very awkward position after this report leaks. And there are, those within his, the Republican Party is kind of split in terms of, like, do we still go ahead? And there were those at the time who still, felt like it was important to have some sort of accountability for horrific human rights abuses. But ultimately, that did not happen, right? And so, I think it's important to talk about the fact that when Joe Biden was running for office in the 2020 election, this was an issue. And he indicated that he was going to treat Saudi Arabia fundamentally differently from the way that it had been handled during the first Trump administration. He specifically said he was going to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah. That was the word that he used. Now, of course, we know that there was a process over time in which that unwound, right? And that's not what happened during the Biden presidency. And you had Joe Biden go to Saudi Arabia, which was very, very awkward, very controversial at the time, especially, as someone who said he was going to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah. When he arrived in Saudi Arabia and MBS came out to meet him, MBS holds out his hand for a handshake. And Biden, knowing how gross and problematic and all of this was, and not wanting to completely whitewash him, gave him a fist bump. If you remember that, there was the awkward fist bump, which got a ton of attention at the time. Like, Biden's doing this, but he's obviously not comfortable. He doesn't want to completely whitewash him. And
fist bumpy kind of guy.
Yeah, so a little fist bump with MBS, right? And then, as the Biden administration continues, you get to the point where, the whole pariah thing and any awkwardness and all of that just kind of gets thrown out, because the Biden administration becomes, really enraptured with the project of expanding the quote unquote Abraham Accords. And, the linchpin of all of that, of course, is Saudi Arabia. So, you have these intensive conversations between Biden administration officials and the Saudis, at extremely high levels, to try to push forward and get a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And, we heard from Biden administration officials and from MBS himself, and of course from Netanyahu, that all of this was extremely close, was on the brink of happening. And then you have October 7th, the horrific Hamas attacks on Israel that happened. All of this, of course, is connected. And, so that's, and then of course the Biden administration is trying to work with the Saudis, I think, understandably, to try to bring about a durable ceasefire in Gaza. And then of course we have Trump come back to office, and you have kind of the arc of all of this come full circle from the first Trump administration through, what I would say, look, I mean, what my politics are, Stephanie. And I'm a Democrat. But I have been, and I will be, extremely critical of the Biden administration's Israel-Palestine Middle East policy. I think it's really important for us to do that in terms of thinking about where we're going to be going forward. But that sort of whitewashing just came totally full circle. And we saw it with, at least one thing that Biden didn't do was invite MBS to come to the United States for an official state visit, rolling out the red carpet, bringing out, the stealth fighters in formation and all of that. And, so we reach kind of the logical end state of all of this with this state visit by MBS. Sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask. You were about to.
So I think, what we could do is just to kind of close this loop on, 2018 and Khashoggi and his horrific killing, is just talk about what happened on that in the Oval Office visit, right? Whether folks watch the whole awful, whatever it is, 47-minute press conference or not, I do recommend finding the exchange of Trump and the ABC reporter, who, thank God, for her, we still have some folks in the media who are trying to do their jobs and who haven't been kicked out of the Oval Office yet, although I imagine that will probably happen to ABC after this. So the ABC reporter asks Trump about the Khashoggi killing and about MBS's role. And Trump, of course, becomes immediately, you just see his demeanor. He becomes incredibly angry. And, he insults her not only as a terrible reporter, to use the quote, but I think very tellingly, he says that is a horrible, insubordinate, and just a terrible question. He uses the word insubordinate, right? Because he expects a press corps to be subordinate to him and only ask questions that are acceptable, not to ask questions about, the Khashoggi killing, not to ask questions about Epstein, any of that, right? So he calls her question insubordinate. And then he says that, he says to the reporter, you're mentioning someone, meaning Khashoggi, that was extremely controversial. A lot of people didn't like that gentleman that you're talking about. Whether you like him or not, things happen, says Trump. Things happen. Dismemberment and beheading happens. But he, referring to MBS sitting next to him, knew nothing about it. You don't have to embarrass our guests, says Trump to the NBC reporter. And it's so interesting then to see MBS's reaction to this, because of course he was prepared for this question. He knew this question was coming. And so, after Trump tries to just insult the hell out of this woman and dismiss the question, then you actually have MBS, give a BS answer, obviously, but actually address the question. And he says, oh, it was a terrible thing that happened and we've dealt with it. And, I mean, all of that is, total bullshit. But at least, he understands that you need to field the question and not, and not answer it by insulting Jamal Khashoggi and making it sound like he had it coming to him and that things just happened. I mean, it was just an absolutely, incredible exchange. And it just, in terms of where we are vis-a-vis human rights, international law, democracy versus authoritarianism, respect for a free media, and the importance of it being able to ask important and difficult questions. It said so much. And I just want to mention one other thing. I saw a piece by Brian Stelter, who is the chief media analyst for CNN, that he published on this. And the headline of it was, Trump's anti-press outburst hits differently with a Saudi prince by his side. And I think that, I give, not going to say that CNN is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I give Stelter, I give him some credit there. Just noting, that Trump is attacking an American reporter for insubordination while literally sitting next to a guy who dealt with an insubordinate citizen of his country, a journalist, by having them dismembered. Right. It really couldn't be more chilling.
It's grotesque.
And I know folks are like, exercised and should be, obviously, about the quiet piggy thing. That's awful. It's misogynist. And, it's important that folks be upset. But what happened really in the Oval Office yesterday in terms of this exchange, I think was just far more chilling and really is something that needs to be talked about.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the kind of trajectory of the relationship between Trump and the family, and Saudi Arabia and MBS, and the money that's going back and forth, and the chumminess, and plus Trump's love of authoritarians and transactional nature of how he thinks about everything in the world. How does that fit with the overall picture of where we are now, given the Epstein stuff, the Epstein financial stuff, which I talked about with Zev last week, and the potential for war with Venezuela, the potential for, what's going on in Israel, Palestine, all of that stuff. Is there a way to sort of bring that together, and the role that the legacy press has taken in abdicating its role as uh, as the analyst that calls things the way they are, as opposed to just prostrating themselves to the Trump administration regime?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a number of pieces of this, and we'll try to connect some dots, some of the dots as best we can. I know you've delved a lot deeper into the Epstein stuff, and I'm love to hear your thoughts on how all of that is is a part of this. I in terms of the corruption, um you kind of talked about some of it. I mean, you have Jared Kushner, who of course is married to Ivanka, Trump's son-in-law, crucially involved in Trump's Middle East policy, particularly in his first term, but obviously that that does continue. Jared Kushner has been able to cash in to the tune of billions of dollars in investments in his endeavors by the Saudis, the Qataris. So he has been able to personally enrich himself. And then, obviously you have the Trump organization, which is similarly involved in, various Trump branded projects that are going up in Saudi Arabia, including, golf courses and et cetera. So, I mean, obviously there is a personal financial stake in all of this, which, by the way, Trump was asked about during the press conference. And, he just kind of like, he shrugs it off and he's like, oh yeah, my family has that business. Like I'm out of that deal. I mean, I have nothing to do with that. In fact, I left that all behind so I could come and, serve America and make this country great again. And, it's what you and I were chatting about this a little bit yesterday. I mean, what is so interesting, by which I really mean horrifically problematic about all of this, is that in Trump's first term, we heard a lot about, people would use the phrase emoluments clause. Remember that clause in our Constitution that people would talk about and be a little bit concerned about a president who had these, vast, far-flung financial interests. And, how was Donald Trump going to kind of like separate himself and, divest from all of that? That was actually something that was talked about during the first term. Not anymore. Mm-hmm. Not anymore. Like, people don't even talk about that anymore. And he's,
it's the Overton window that he has been steadily moving.
Yes.
As has the entire Republican Party, as has the far right, and we can get to that, but it has shifted entirely since the beginning of the first administration.
So much so. I mean, the Overton window has shifted in terms of the corruption piece, obviously in terms of the authoritarianism piece, in terms of the behavior that you deem remotely acceptable on the part of a president. I mean, the Overton window has shifted in so many ways. And you and I were also talking about, I know we're both Timothy Snyder fans.
Timothy Snyder.
Right? Yes. Timothy Snyder,
If you are not following Timothy Snyder yet, you need to be, because everything he says is right. Everything. And he left, he was at Yale, and now he's at University of Toronto because of, what's going on now. as part of the brain drain. Well, whatever, but it is big brain drain because
Yes. Yes.
there is also a war on higher education, which
Of course.
we will talk about in a different session because that's
course.
a whole story on its own. Okay.
Extremely important one in terms of your, freedom over fascism. Obviously, that's a hugely important story. But so Timothy Snyder, I mention him because he published a piece within the past week that was called "The Grift Bubble," and it's a real. I mean, like you said, everything that he writes is important to read, but that piece in particular. I mean, just to, give the 2 cent poor person's version, it basically talks about Trump and Vance as, imagining that, vis-a-vis the corruption stuff, that, they live in this grift bubble. They think that they can, at this point, the lesson that they've gotten is that they can get away with absolutely anything, right? I mean, corruption, totally fine, however far they want to take it. And basically, what Snyder argues is that when you're inside this grift bubble, there's stuff outside the bubble that you actually don't realize. And that, there are folks outside the bubble who are suffering, who actually still, feel things like patriotism. And, the grift bubble kind of, the corruption, all of that holds. You can be in your grift bubble until all of a sudden the bubble bursts. And I mean, what he warns about is that when that happens, the entire system crashes down. And I think it's just, this isn't corruption in and of itself is bad enough. And you and I have both spent a lot of time studying the Middle East. And, we know what regimes, non-democratic regimes, dictatorships look like, where corruption is just baked in, where everybody understands that, everything operates on the basis of wasta, which is like, intermediary, who. That's not the way the United States has ever been. That's not the expectation here. And there is, the what Snyder is raising is that, Trump can keep moving the Overton window and Overton window until all of a sudden everything kind of explodes and the Overton window can't just be moved any further. And so anyway, I mean, that's just, the corruption is connected with everything else. It's connected with the authoritarianism. It's, you raise the, the prospects that we are going to be, at war in the Southern Hemisphere with Venezuela and, over Venezuela and God knows what else. But, I think, it's also incredibly dangerous to be in a situation where, there's we know that there's a dude who in the White House who operates on the basis of transactionalism, where it's all about him. It's all about his ego. It's all about the grift, right? And there is no reason for us to believe that the welfare of Americans, including our national security, is actually part of that equation. I mean, look, I've talked about the Biden administration. I have profound disagreements with the Biden administration. And we could spend lots of time. I have spent lots of time criticizing them. But at the end of the day, even if they were getting things wrong, and they got a lot wrong, I do believe that they were trying, as far as U.S. foreign policy and national security stuff, that they were actually trying to act in the American interest, right? With Trump,
which should be a no-brainer, given like the fact that the president, the people running a country ought to be acting in the country's best interest, which we could get to in terms of like the policy implications of all of the blackmail and stuff like that. But
Of
let's get
course.
there later.
Of course. Of course. But, when we look at some of the, I mean, if I could talk for a minute about some of like the specific deliverables that are coming out of MBS's visit. I mean, so just talk about a couple of them. One of them is that, and the thing that's going to actually come to fruition the quickest in terms of, what the United States is giving to MBS and the Saudis. We're going to give them the world's fastest chips so that they can become a leader in AI. Stephanie, you just joined me, an hour or so ago for a conversation that I had with Avner Gvaryahu, who is a phenomenal Israeli human rights activist who ran an organization called Breaking the Silence. And one of the things that we talked about was the use of AI in war, and how that was, manifested in terms of Israel's war in Gaza, and the shocking numbers of killings that were able to happen extremely quickly, the devastation that happened to the Gaza Strip. Do I feel good about a regime with a long history of human rights abuses having that same kind of technology? No, I don't. Do I have any confidence that the Trump administration is actually thinking about any of this stuff in terms of U.S. national security, regional security? No, I don't. So there was the world's fastest chips thing, right? The other thing, the other deliverable, another deliverable, not the only other one, was the F-35s, right? Trump has indicated that for the first time ever, he's going to the United States. We're going to be selling Saudi Arabia F-35s. There is such a thing known as, for anyone who follows, Middle East regional stuff, especially anything regarding Israel, Palestine. There's something called qualitative military edge, QME, which is actually mandated under US law since 2008. And what that US law says is that Israel always has to have a qualitative military edge over any other power in the Middle East, right? For Israel's national security. And because of that law, right, the United States is not allowed by law to sell other Middle Eastern powers the highest technologies that only Israel possesses within the region, like F-35s. And so if we go back to the Abraham Accords in 2020, one of the parties to the Abraham Accords was the UAE. And one of the things that the UAE wanted to get out of it was F-35s. And in the end, because Congress has to authorize a sale like that, Congress would not authorize the sale because of the requirement for Israel's qualitative military edge, right? Trump was asked about that in the press conference yesterday. He was asked, how can the U.S. sell, like Trump declared, we're going to sell Saudis F-35s. Yep. And a reporter asked him, well, wait a minute, what about the requirement in U.S. law that Israel has to have a qualitative military edge? How do you square these things? And Trump was like, Israel's our friend. Saudi Arabia's our friend. It's all good. They can all have F-35s. Look, whatever you think about the merits of that, the fact that there is a U.S. law that speaks to this, and he just totally dismisses it. And of course, as like the most pro-Israel president, and Netanyahu's best friend and all of that, just fascinating that he just waves this off and don't worry about it. We're going to go sell Saudi Arabia F-35s. Do I have confidence that that is good for U.S. national security? No, I don't. And then talk about there's a, major security agreement that we don't know all of the details about. But we do know, from what Trump announced, that now Saudi Arabia is going to be elevated to the status of major non-NATO ally. Okay.
Well, the other we see how we treat allies, first of all. Second of all, Mason in the chat said, oh, Debra, the law is so yesterday.
Well, I know, right? Overton window. We don't care, the law.
Right. Yeah. So I don't even know how, like, we've connected a bazillion dots, and what you get out of it is that the Trump regime is bad and evil and dictatorial and has thrown the law. The law doesn't matter anymore. In fact, I don't know if you saw it this morning, but in the Comey case,
Hmm.
it came out in trial this morning that the grand jury that indicted him never saw the papers of indictment.
I hadn't seen that.
So, like, every level of law is completely thrown out the window.
Yeah.
Internationally, Trump does not act in the American interest and has acted in. I mean, remember the first thing that happened in the first administration is that he had the Russians in the Oval Office and he
Yes.
gave them
Yes.
intelligence
Yes.
about
Yes.
Israeli operatives. And um and he burned a lot of our American agents and operatives. So the question in my mind, and it's not even really a question, is so Trump has done a lot of things in the Russians' interest. Sometimes they talk about Ukraine in the, we're going to help Ukraine, but you know that, like, really it's Putin's interest. We know that that Trump has behaved with Israel in a way that no other president has. Um, we and we know through some of the files that Israel has whatever compromising information about Trump that exists. And so I wonder, who else has it? What else are they holding over us? What are the nuclear implications? What are the basic security implications? What's going on with China? All of this stuff is now feels like our entire place in the world is now thrown up like a deck of cards, and who knows where it's going to land.
Yeah. I have no doubt that a lot more is going to come out about all of that. And I know you're talking to exactly the folks who are, really digging very deeply into all of that. And folks should, obviously follow. If any of my folks are here and they don't already
follow Zev Shalev and Ellie Leonard. They're the two people that are most active in digging as deep as they can, and they find information that the rest of the people don't because they spend so much time looking at it. Zev has been working on it for a decade, the financial side, and he has put together the absolute financial devastation that Epstein and his buddies have wrought. So you should read it. It's called The Greatest Heist. So anyway, follow him because he's amazing.
But just to, bring it back also to the, latest developments. I mean, when I woke up this morning and, grabbed the news to see the latest news is that the White House is now saying that, a deal on Ukraine, Russia is imminent. And so apparently, this deal is a deal that's been negotiated between the White House and Putin's team. And Putin's team is saying, this has been great. Our concerns have been heard. This is going to deal with our fundamental grievances that we brought to the table before, the 2022 war started, which of course obviously started when they invaded a sovereign country. And this is news not only to us waking up reading about this morning, the administration saying that there could be a deal even within a week, which now
but everything's in 2 weeks, so like we have to
Which now, but now, I mean, what's, so there's going to be a high level US military delegation that's going to Kyiv to basically like read Zelensky in on the deal. But I think, and that's horrific enough as it is, obviously the other folks who have not been read into this deal besides the Ukrainians are our European allies who have a tremendous amount at stake in terms of their own vital national security interests here. And it goes back to the, who your friends are, who Trump went to visit on his first trip back in 2017. I'm glad you raised that at the very beginning of our conversation, right? And throwing our closest allies, our fellow democratic states with whom the United States created a post-World War II order, right, characterized by democracy and, with the underpinning of international law, as however imperfect as it may be, however incredibly imperfectly it's ever been followed, all of that is just getting thrown out the window. With obviously a government in Washington that is governed by a man who's deeply involved in corruption and, and God knows what else vis-a-vis, all of the Epstein stuff. And, it's just.
Okay. So it is now very close to the top of the hour. And I want to give you time to tell people where to find you. But one thing I ask everybody that I have on is,
Okay.
when we eventually get past this moment, we are going to need radical creativity to rebuild something that will last. And I probably should have let you know that I was going to ask this. What would you do, given like all constraints of reality aside, that would be the most radically creative thing that you could do to help America be what we think it ought to be?
So I'm going to shift the question a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because look, my focus for the last, zillion years, and my specialty, is Middle East, Israel, Palestine stuff. So, lots of other people will have great answers to that in terms of like trying to salvage the American democratic, project. But I'm going to kind of stick to my lane. And what I'm going to say is this, should we manage to survive this, God willing, there needs to be a fundamentally different approach on the issue of Israel, Palestine, and the U.S. relationship to the Middle East. And, I've talked a lot about it in terms of the Biden administration and, a policy that the Biden administration undertook, of basically, allowing the furthest right regime that Israel has ever had to operate with complete impunity, and to Israel's detriment, right? Not only obviously to the detriment of the Palestinians, obviously, but also to, the detriment of, this country that, many of us care deeply about, and in a way that has been destabilizing in so many ways that has, I mean, that honestly, I could not have even anticipated, far beyond Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories. I mean, we have seen, in terms of what we've seen on American campuses, in terms of this issue, being used to shut down free speech in America. And, there has to be a fundamentally different approach that is based on equal rights, dignity, self-determination, shared society. And I mean, yeah, I'm staying in my like tiny little lane,
But that's
but
the
it's also
whole.
a lane that has, much broader implications. And that's what I want to see. And that's what I'm working toward.
And it's not just something for over there. It's the
Right.
whole. It's the whole enchilada, right? Is
Mhm.
human rights and dignity and respect and
Right.
empathy and compassion.
Right.
And whether it's directed in the international realm or internally, that's the bottom line about what most of us here, all of us here, most of us in the United States want for
Right.
our country and the world. So I think that that's absolutely vital.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you have an administration, I'm talking about the Biden administration, that holds up, human rights and international law and all of that when it comes to like Ukraine, Russia, and then suddenly, it's out the window on Israel, Palestine. I mean, the hypocrisy is apparent to everyone.
Well, that was part of
And
the problem, like they talked about even internally that there was such danger to democracy and they sure didn't act like it.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly.
All right. Now I'll tell everybody where they can find you and how they can support you and kind of a one sentence summary of why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, I started about 4 months ago this new Substack called The Debrief with Debra Shushan. And it's kind of like all things Israel, Palestine, Middle East, and the intersection with US foreign policy and democracy and Jewish American politics. And if any of that is interesting to you, then like come on over to The Debrief with Debra Shushan and check out what I'm up to. It would be a pleasure to have you along.
Well, and if you should be able to just subscribe at the top of your screen. But I really enjoyed this conversation, Deborah, and I feel like there are so many other conversations we need to have, and I would love to have you back to have them.
Yalla, let's do it.
All right.
Thank you so much for
Yalla,
having me,
inshallah.
Stephanie.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.